Newsom, how you doing?
Yes, sir. Good to see you, Jack.
Good to see you, sir. Um, we're here to talk about your book,
Yep.
Sir Basil Liddell Hart, Life, Thought, and Legacy. There we are.
Yep.
Reading through this, well, first of all, I got to ask you, what attracted you to this guy?
Well, I was an undergraduate in war studies at King's College London, which has the Liddell Hart Centre of Military Archives.
Oh, okay.
And I was a very keen student of war. I was a soldier at the time, and I spent a lot of time in those archives towards my term papers and so forth, and learned more about Liddell Hart himself because he was so central to Anglophone military thought from the 1920s to 1970 and beyond, because his legacy lived on in some very influential uh, war studies professors, lecturers, including famous people like Michael Howard, Brian Bond. And so his legacy was still the the core the core philosophy of the War
Mhm.
Studies Department, even when I got there in the 1990s. And uh, we were certainly taught a lot about him from people who knew him personally, like Brian Bond. And uh, he was central to how certainly the British Army was approaching strategy then, if not now. As in the sense that he's the most often quoted authority on war when doctrinal documents need a quote to begin a chapter or to illustrate some principle of war in the manual. It was only later on that I started to come across people questioning both the viability of the strategies he was talking about, such as all tank raids, indirect approaches uh, that would avoid fighting altogether, and his claims to have invented blitzkrieg. I really studied it. And I went back to those archives and studied the man, his development of thought, and went back and reread everything that he had written in the time, which surprisingly other biographers hadn't done.
Mm.
They relied on his um, paraphrasing of what he had written. So that's how he got away, for instance, with claiming that he invented blitzkrieg, because he would say, "Well, my article of 1923 invented blitzkrieg because I advocated for the combination of tanks and infantry in fast, deep penetrations." And that claim wasn't checked up, amazingly. When I reread the article, it's nothing of the sort. Uh, it's actually an advocacy for infantry to attack on their own without other arms, apart from some tracked carriers for their heavy equipment and ammunition. And he called that carrier a tank. So he was able to say, well, I advocated the combination of tanks and infantry and other arms, which he didn't. Right. These discoveries were quite shocking to me because it cast doubt on the man himself, but also the people who had taught about the man. And it took a long time for me to gather enough information to think there's a biography here. Biographies are very challenging. This is my first published biography. They're different to writing narrative history about war or even analytical history about strategy. All of those things come together in a biography about a military man. You have to be an analyst, a historian, and a biographer, and it's very hard work. So it's taken, counting my undergraduate days, it's taken 25, let's say 30 years to produce this biography, including the initial work way back when in the archives. So I think it's an important biography. It's the first biography that's not been written by one of Basil Liddell Hart's disciples or a disciple of a disciple. And like I say, it's the first one to quote from his original readings rather than quote from his memoirs about his original writings. So I was motivated, because he's so central, and he's actually more fascinating as a in an honest depiction, warts and all, the brilliance, but also the dishonesty, the strategies as they were originally written, but also the misrepresentations. The man who rose and fell and rose again, like he was at the heart of government. He was advising prime ministers like Neville Chamberlain in the 1930s. He was at the heart of bad policies like appeasement. Um, he was at the heart of good policies like modernization, mechanization into the 1930s, and then utterly discredited in the 1940s because he advocated for a defensive posture, and he said you can be confident that mechanized offensives will not win. Will not win. They will not. We can just sit defensive in France, and the Germans will soon give up. He also advocated a long war, a long economic war, of little fighting, which also didn't work. So he's discredited in the 40s. And then amazingly, he built up his reputation again with some dishonesty, such as claiming authorship of Blitzkrieg, but also some insight into current events, such as nuclear weapons. So it's just a fascinating life story with huge implications for politics, military strategy, and British society as a whole. Yeah, so I was very motivated to do it, and I'm just sorry that it took so long to make it right.
You know, uh, it, it's the non-authorized biographies are the only ones, or the only ones worth reading. Authorized ones are just too, you know, too controlled. But no, you cut into this man and you describe him, and there's a bunch of questions that came up for me as I was reading. Number one was, well, his psychology. I mean, a psychological profile of Liddell Hart. What you know, that seemed to be an element to his story that just hung over everything. I mean, it drove him. And question I have is, you mentioned before to be a real a military thinker, you have to be a strategist and you have to be a researcher. You have to be, basically a intellectual. His most compelling art was seemed to be in his writing. That's how he rose to the level that he eventually achieved. Um, I, almost like a stage show where it has all the flourishes and all the elements to make a compelling argument. But underneath it, when you pull the curtain back, it's the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. Well, he was certainly a very complex character. Having said that, the events in his life that made him complex are quite understandable
Uh-huh.
individually. So I think there are, for the audience's benefit, there are probably three or four key parts of his life which help us to understand the man as he developed. First, he had a very privileged background, came from a very wealthy family, well-traveled family.
Mhm.
However, his education was not good. He was barely tutored at home for a while. He went to schools where he didn't fit in. He was a bit of a mummy's boy, as
Mhm.
he admitted at times. He did not fit in any institution, in fact, including the army. He was lonely in all of these institutions, although that was not necessarily the image he liked to portray later. So his schooling was not good,
Mhm.
and that uh, manifested as a professionally later on as a certain naivety about science and logic, but not just naivety, some misrepresentation. So he often described himself as a scientist. He said he was offering a scientific study of war. He was offering military science, and he wasn't. His science, his understanding of hard science was non-existent. His understanding of the scientific method was just ranging from misinformed to downright dishonest. So he would, for instance, he would, for instance, claim that he had a scientific uh, insight that nobody else could get because they're all biased and they're all conservative. Right? His most common accusation of other people was they were conservative, and yet his own thinking was pretty much conservative. Uh, and so what he really meant when he said scientific was he claimed he was being objective. Everybody else was biased and he was being objective. But he was biased by an awful lot of things, particularly the trauma of the Great War. He didn't have a good war in the sense that he neither he neither excelled professionally, he didn't form good social relationships. He broke down psychologically every time he was in the front line. Um, he was eventually sent back to England. He was actually sent back twice, and the second time he was in England for good for the rest of the war, and that colored it provided him a motivated bias for the rest of his life, which colors all of his strategic thinking as well as his political thinking, which is that we must avoid a war as traumatic as the Great War. And it led him to fantasies such as we can fight wars without fighting, we can have wars without casualties. If only we could take this indirect approach and shock the enemy, with speed and surprise and unexpected approaches. Boom, the enemy would just give up. Or we could have these long wars over decades where we just economically outlast the enemy and the enemy can't get at us because our defenses are so strong. So he had these motivated biases which help to explain his strategies. So he's certainly traumatized by the Great War. The third thing I'll mention is there's a lot of vanity in the way he was brought up. He was brought up to think that he was a great intellect. His intellect was patchy. He could be incredibly insightful. He could be penetratingly insightful. He was certainly focused. He certainly was focused to the extent of being obsessive compulsive. He was also very hardworking, but he was also dogmatic. And his lack of scientific training and his vanity about his intellect made him very close-minded. And the irony, as I said earlier, was this was a very conservative man, and certainly conservative in an intellectual sense. Once he'd settled on something, once he decided this is what something should be, he would pretend that is how it is. And that's very true with his motivated biases towards certain strategies. And then, so the fourth stage, I would say, is in the 1930s, he became very influential politically. He was in government effectively. We would call him today a special advisor. The British government would call him a special advisor, which is a formal appointee. He was a special advisor to the Secretary of State for Defense. He was an informal advisor to the predecessors in that position, to Winston Churchill in his wilderness years, to Neville Chamberlain when Neville Chamberlain was first Chancellor of the Exchequer and then Prime Minister. He had great influence as uh, the military correspondent for the Daily Telegraph newspaper, and then the Times. The two papers which were closest to government, the Times being the most influential. In fact, the Times editors were formally their formal line until very late in the 1930s. Their formal line was to promote Neville Chamberlain. He had this great audience, and then in part because he was so hardworking and he was a prolific writer, he had audience in other outlets too, including professional military journals. And that influence went to his head, and he became more arrogant uh, about his own importance to the security of Britain and to the West, and more dogmatic. And it became stressful for him, and he had a number of breakdowns. And eventually, his big one was in the summer of 1939, which ended his employment at the Times, ended his relationship with the Chamberlain government, with Leslie Hall Belisha, who was the Secretary of Defense, and then and just to give some context, he was so stressed at that time because he opposed the things that we now consider belated. He opposed rearmament. He opposed confrontation with Germany. He was an appeaser, despite his claims later. And he went on speaking tours. He was a very shy and actually very insecure, very poor public speaker. But he went on a public speaking tour after the Munich crisis in September 1938. And he did this speaking tour for some months, and it was just stressful. And that led to this long psychological breakdown in 1939. So that gave him some humility. It took him out of the limelight for a while. During the Second World War, he was certainly discredited by the time France fell in June of 1940, and he retreated. He retreated literally into the wilderness. He moved home once, twice to be further away from what he thought was going to be the invasion coast. And he still tried to have influence through letters, but he was rejected. He was an MI5 file was opened on as a sympathizer for Nazism, and somebody who was advocating through private correspondence to make peace with Germany. Again, this is something that is ignored in the prior biographies, but the correspondence is very clear. He was advocating to negotiate peace with Germany. And Winston Churchill considered him a traitor when some of these documents came across the Prime Minister's desk. So he was an apologist he was regarded as an apologist for Nazism in the 1940s, including after the war when he was advocating against war crimes trials, claiming that that Hitler was not wrong to start the war. He was provoked by belligerent policies from Britain. This was his attempt to justify appeasement, but it wasn't really appeasement. It was peaceful accommodation of international law, which was a pretty bizarre way of thinking about it. But he thought that Chamberlain had provoked. This was his retrospective claim that Chamberlain had provoked Hitler into war particularly by making the guarantee of Poland's security in August of 1939. So it wasn't Hitler's fault, and therefore it wasn't the Nazi Party's fault. It wasn't any of the Nazi officials, soldiers. So he was seen as an apologist for Nazism, and he never, by the way, never retreated from that position. He was constantly reinterpreting it. I was an anti-appeaser, but I also was against provocation. He was always trying to resell this impossible squaring of the circle. So he was discredited through the 1940s. And then you have this incredible rebound in the 1950s where he gets hold of German prisoners of war and advocates for them, makes gifts for them, hooks them up with lawyers to defend them, um, and uh, and gets information out of them that he then publishes as the other side of the hill, where he's speaking for the generals that he interviewed to get their side of the war, and the quickness with which he produced the book made this a unique book at the time. It was the Anglophone world did not have that insight. Excuse my cats. They're not fighting. That's actually playing. So
So far, the
he
interview,
was
at least. Yeah.
uh, he he had this quick book that was very popular, and along the way he was inserting his own brilliance into this book. So he made false claims such as, when I was interviewing the German generals, they made clear to me that Blitzkrieg was based on what I'd written before the war. Right? There's no evidence for that, and you go back to the correspondence. There's nothing in the correspondence from these German generals to suggest anything of the kind. It was just that little nudge, that little suggestion, and then sympathetic journalists would take that forward, and he would issue biographies, autobiographies, right, biographies, bios that he'd written of himself. He would issue those to journalists saying, he invented Blitzkrieg and he was against appeasement and stuff like that. And journalists would just regurgitate that stuff. And I have to say, there's obviously a motivated bias in the Anglophone world, having been embarrassed by Blitzkrieg
Mhm.
and been on the losing side of most of the battles up till 1943. There was a motivation to find an Anglophone hero who could take credit for the German successes. So there was a receptive audience to this. And then he travels to America, which is least informed about his writing, and he makes a lot of contacts and really pushes this narrative
Mhm.
most effectively in America. And then back in Britain, he discovers some young academics, such as Michael Howard, who is a lecturer in history, struggling with his own disappointments as a soldier during the Second World War, his own PTSD, uh, and his own insecurities about his training as a historian. And he influences Michael Howard and then younger and younger historians in this narrative. And they teach it. They teach the Liddell Hart version of history. And this culminates with his memoirs in the 1960s, two enormous volumes of memoirs, which mostly saying, as I advocated at the time, we should have we should have combined tanks and other arms. And there's no sourcing, there's no citations, there's no evidence or any of this, but there's a receptive audience. The memoirs were very well reviewed, including by people like Michael Howard. So there's a self-interested reinforcing loop going on here. And that's how he ended his life in the 1960s as the as he self-presented himself as the unsung hero, British hero of the interwar period. If only people had listened to him, other than the Germans.
Yeah.
And he was knighted by the Queen. He was extremely wealthy from royalties. Uh, he traveled to Israel and made an additional narrative that he was responsible for Israeli success against in the Arab wars. And he died feted, and he continued to be feted by his disciples for decades until actually John Mearsheimer came along in 1988 with a critical view book. It was a book critical view of his contradictions between his writings on things like tank warfare um, between the wars, and then what claims he made after the Second World War. But even then, John Mearsheimer was roundly condemned for polemicism, which is ironic because Liddell Hart was certainly a polemicist. And the 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 historiography remained in tension for another few decades.
Mhm.
And I think it's time, it's overdue, right? So my biography, published in 1920, sorry, 2025,
Right,
that's 135 years since the man was born.
right.
So a biography, an honest biography, taking the good and the bad, is overdue.
It's funny, as you mentioned John Mearsheimer, and as I was reading about Sir Basil, uh, John Mearsheimer came to mind because I try to make the connection between the past and the present day, and I was thinking that if he was observing today's conflict in the Ukraine, he'd be pretty much on the side of John Mearsheimer as given his past.
Yeah,
Uh, he would probably be taking the same stances.
yeah,
Appeasement. It wasn't Russia who started the war; they were goaded. And to see that Mearsheimer was a critic of Liddell Hart was had a twist to it that you know I, I couldn't get over. What do you think of that? My own comment, my own humble observation.
yeah. So you're quite right. There is an interesting parallel between John Mearsheimer, the critic of Liddell Hart, somebody who scratched the surface of his archives and realized this guy was actually at least equivocal about appeasement, if he was not an appeaser himself. And yet, and categorizing Liddell Hart as an appeaser because Liddell Hart's bias was to not confront Nazi Germany. His bias was we will defend our borders, our own borders. And when, by the way, he was not keen on British troops even going to France.
Mm,
There was some back and forth in his writing, but certainly his ideal was Britain defends Britain and doesn't go to the continent again because the continent, when British troops last went to the continent to fight a war, he was traumatized by it, and he saw um, carnage that he never wanted to. He never wanted British soldiers to ever suffer again. So he um, so Little Heart, so Mearsheimer identified this uh, what would you call a sense unilateralism. I don't think I'm just was stuck there because I don't think Mearsheimer ever used the word
mhm.
unilateralist to describe Little Heart. I have in my biography because I identify where his writings in the 30s were saying Britain should not have alliances. Right? Think of how crazy that sounds now after the Second World War, when we have a NATO alliance, when the consensus is that you need to be allied, you need to be in a defensive alliance in Europe in order to secure Europe. He was against any alliances that Britain should have because he feared the entanglement of Britain getting dragged into continental wars. He just wanted to defend the homeland.
It seemed like he
He
was afraid of entanglements on every level,
yeah, well,
personal,
yeah,
professional.
yeah, that's very insightful, Jack. Yes, yeah, we should talk about that because he was socially, he was afraid of social entanglements, even at the same time as he was very aggressive in his social networking.
Mhm.
So yes, there is a parallel there too. And certainly if Little Heart was alive today, and the choice was between British troops going to Ukraine, even as a peacekeeping force, he would be against that.
I know.
He would probably be happy with Britain financing Ukraine because that fulfills this his ideal of remote warfare, of economic warfare without fighting. But there's the irony that you identify correctly. The irony that Mearsheimer now and Little Heart would be on the same page, opposing Western entanglements in Ukraine against Russia, an aggressor.
You had to go and you had to write up a very complicated figure. And you must have gone in your research and in your writing, gone from being sympathetic to being a critic, to being, admirer of this man. Well, and you did a very good job of not being judgmental in the book. But eventually, was there a place you landed with regards to Sir Basil?
Well, what I wanted to do was just to be honest, to bring the facts out. So I wanted to bring out the good and the bad, the 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 worthy insights as well as the dishonesty, the dishonest retelling, in fact, the disinformation about his own record. So I just wanted to be factual and truthful because there is a lot one can take from Little Heart of intellectual use, if not lessons from the life of the man. You can take intellectual insights about strategy, things like the indirect approach. They're still worthy concepts, even though his presentation of the indirect approach was internally contradictory and and often dishonest, where he would claim, the Blitzkrieg was an indirect approach, and then any success becomes an indirect approach retrospectively, even though obviously at the time of the Blitzkrieg he said it wasn't going to work. There's no way through modern defenses. That's what he said. So the biography, I wanted just to clarify what other biographers had not clarified, which is what do we take forward as worthy, and what do we honestly categorize as false, both false intellectually, like it was empirically false, logically false, or false in the retelling. So you can't. For me, I don't think we can. We cannot take Basil Liddell Hart forward unless we're honest about warts and all. Now, you asked about where I landed. Uh, I I still have sympathy for the man. So the man suffered. He had a terrible war. He, in many ways, he had terrible schooling. He was bullied. He His professional trajectory was tragic. I mean, he restored his reputation, but he was at the pinnacle of politics and military influence in the 1930s, and it collapsed. He was discredited, and he was rightfully discredited. Uh, and yet he rebuilt himself. I mean, I don't condone the dishonesty. I think he still could have rebuilt himself in an honest way. He could have said, "I was wrong about this," but there are still parts of what I was saying at the time which were right, and that we should continue to develop. Help me to develop what I failed to fully develop at the time. I still have sympathy for the man, but it's all about honesty. It's all about being factual and honest about history. That was not something that Little Hart was particularly good at. He was not honest about himself. He was very uh, um, he was very vain in how he presented himself, and he was stuck in uh, that very insecure, and it must have been very hard work for him to be constantly thinking about spinning. He was spinning. He was always spinning himself. Because you'd have a casual conversation, and somebody would say something about history, and he would say, "Well, I knew that person, and of course I influenced that person, and if only that person had listened to me at the time, everything would be all right." I mean, it must have been very hard work. It must have been very stressful. So, and this was a man who had tics. He had nervous tics. He had very few friends. He probably had, in our sense, probably had no friends. But he had a lot of acquaintances, and he pursued these acquaintances. But everybody who, even the people who were closest to him, regarded him as very tense. and somebody who could explode too at them, particularly if they said anything that he might interpret as impugning him, as doubting his version of events. So it must have been a very stressful, hard-working life that he led, and I'm sympathetic with and I'm sympathetic with his motivations. He was very strongly motivated to avoid another great war, and none of us can condone that. We're all interested in avoiding war. He was wrong in many of the ways he tried to avoid war, and the ways he advocated for fighting a war without fighting. But the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and he had some good intentions.
Yes, you used the term fashionable scholarship in describing him, and it seems like that's what he descended to at the end. A guy looking, or someone looking for a stage or a mic that he can speak into or set foot on. I just wondering how he would survive today. I mean, I try to make the connections and update past characters with today's events. And in today's world, where everyone is bombarded with so much information, 24-hour news cycles, where we get to the point where we seek out the news and information we want to hear with almost little regard to whether it's the truth or not. I think he would have survived quite well. He would easily establish an audience, and he was almost tailor made for a later time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, I think you're definitely true that he was a man who uh, he kind of told people what they wanted to hear,
Uh,
and what was fashionable at different stages of his life changed, and he changed along with the consensus, or at least the elite consensus of the time. So, for instance, during the Great War, he was extremely nationalistic.
mhm.
And I should go back before the Great War. He considered himself a socialist. He had and he opposed and an anti-militarist. He opposed the military. He had no interest in ROTC at Cambridge University. He had no intents to join the army. And then all of a sudden, the Great War breaks out, and he becomes this militarist nationalist. He writes of himself in these ways, and talks about Britain is the greatest nation, and war is a wonderful opportunity for a young man, and stuff like completely contradictory to what had gone before. And even when he's recovering from his final psychological collapse in the Battle of the Somme, he's writing that Britain has the greatest generals. Douglas Haig is the greatest general ever. Um, and then, which is ironic because by the 30s, he's saying everybody involved was terrible. They sacrificed my generation with their incompetence and their conservatism. Et cetera, et cetera. And then in the 1920s, he's still posing as this professional insider, and he's speaking as a soldier. He's now in the Army Education Corps. He's speaking as a soldier to other soldiers and saying, I'm going to tell you how we could have won the war efficiently back then. And he's actually at this point he's selling to the British German infiltration tactics. He's claiming that it's his own invention, which he calls the expanding torrent. He calls it a number of different things.
Mhm.
The expanding torrent is how that was the term he later settled on. And he was saying, Basil Liddell Hart, I have seen the future, without admitting that he was just reselling German tactics of the war. And then he doesn't work well. He gets this moment of glory where he thinks he's being promoted by General Maxey's to serve on the infantry training manual. And he certainly presents himself later as having written the whole manual, but in fact, his inserts are largely rejected. And his private correspondence reveals his disappointment with this, and then he flips on the army. So going from a soldier who loved the army and um, considered himself an insider and wanted to help the army, he flips on the army and he says the army is full of conservatives and they hate intellectuals. They're all anti-intellectuals, and I'll never get anywhere in this army. And he goes into journalism, where he has more privileges, but he's also schizophrenic about journalists. Accuses them of conservatism too, depending on whether they're receptive or not to what he's saying. Um, and then in the 1930s, by the way, in the 1920s, 30s, he's just advising whatever political party is ascendant at the time. Radical socialists in the 20s, and then he's advising the conservatives in the 1930s as they ascend, like Stanley Baldwin and then Neville Chamberlain, which is ironic because this is where he's railing against conservatism with a small c, as he's advising conservatives with a big C. But that was the government at the time, so that's he sort of confirmed and seconded their prejudices, which is appeasement and strategic bombers and isolationism from the continent. And then in the 40s, he's also telling the audience what they want to hear, which is that the, the Blitzkrieg and the terrible defeats we suffered were not German inventions at all. They were actually British. So we can take some comfort that when Britain was humiliated, it was actually humiliated by British ideas, right? And then during the Cold War, what we haven't discussed so far is some very interesting writings during the Cold War where he's coming up with some pretty bizarre but comforting ideas about the Cold War, such as if only we would behave with good manners, the Soviet Union will never attack us. And I'm not paraphrasing. Good manners. That was the phrase he used. And again, it actually overlapped his appeasement of the 1930s. He was basically saying, just leave Russia alone, right? He called it Russia, Soviet Union, but he habitually called it Russia. But if we leave the Soviet Union alone, it's not going to do anything. It's not aggressive, and it's not malign towards Britain. And if you try to contain it, you're just going to provoke it, and they're going to pick on Britain because Britain is really easy to invade. That, by the way, that was based on his sudden discovery of airborne landings, right? He had never predicted airborne forces as being as important to the Second World War as they were. And then retrospectively, he claimed that he had, and he had this idea that the Soviet Union would just send paratroopers and they'd land in Britain to take over Britain all on their own. Paratroopers would do that. So he thought Britain is uniquely vulnerable. This seems like a contrivance in order to persuade the British again to withdraw from the continent and not provoke the Soviet Union because Britain is uniquely vulnerable. So he's by the way, just to make that clear, he was saying the Soviet Unions would land paratroopers on Britain but invade nowhere else. It's just they were just going to punish Britain. So I mean, there's some they're interesting ideas, but pretty out there ideas about the Cold War. But again, it confirms this pattern mode in his behavior that he's always trying to tell people what they want to hear, and he's reassuring people that the Cold War is not going to end in global catastrophe. Britain can avoid it. The continent and America, they might have their problems, but Britain can avoid that by just withdrawing and so forth. So yes, he was a man who told people what they wanted to hear. Now, you made the point about social media. So in some sense, he would have thrived in social media because he was very prolific. He was a very prolific writer. I mean, he wrote many books per year, articles every month, newspaper reports every week, journalistic reports every week. He was very prolific, so social media would appeal to him. However, there's a caveat to that. He was very effective in private correspondence, and private correspondence was to his advantage because it was difficult for people to catch out his misrepresentations because he held the correspondence. So there's a classic example of Blitzkrieg where um, when he was making the claims to have invented Blitzkrieg, a German researcher, honestly said to him, "I can't find any evidence." um, and 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 Little Hart's normative reaction to people who would question where the evidence, he would say, "Well, if you had read my archives, if you had read my books at the time, if you had read all these things, if you had contacted me, I could have told you what the evidence is."
Yeah.
So he relied on the privacy of correspondence and also his personal control of the evidence, like the documents. He had a personal archive, which then became the Liddell Hart Center for Military Archives, and he was accumulating other people's documents, not just his own. And he
Yeah.
had the archive in his home, actually in the stable block of his home complex. And he was controlling that information. So I think social media would have challenged him on that, a bit like how cancel culture can go
Right.
search your social media history and find where you've made something that is today unacceptable. He would have been caught out by some of that.
The research must have been, uh, it must have gone from frustration to a good laugh every now and then. But you know, you, it was just I brought up in the beginning his psychological profile as part of the icon that he created. They were inseparable, or at least entwined so much. And you did a great job of putting it out there and letting us judge a pretty complicated man who the thing he loathed the most was complications.
That's right.
But it was a great read. Uh, I'm probably going to reread it very shortly because I'm sure I missed some real nuggets. And all I can do is thank you for writing this book.
Well, thank you, sir. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about it. I respect you, Jack, as somebody who's really deep into this historiography themselves.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you got more out of this book than you had got elsewhere.
Well, that's just the first read.